It was a summer morning in suburban Millsboro, smelling of freshly mown grass and flowers from Emily's flower beds. The sun, lazily climbing over the horizon, was reflected in the glass windows of the Petersons' two-story house, where life was already in full swing. The white facade with neat blue shutters, the perfectly trimmed lawn, and the swing in the backyard, it all looked like a postcard from a family happiness magazine. Neighbors, passing by, couldn't help but smile as they looked at the house, as if it were living proof that the American dream still existed. Inside the house, in a spacious kitchen with wood cabinets and marble countertops, Mark Peterson was preparing breakfast. His movements were practiced, almost automatic. He deftly cracked eggs into a frying pan, stirred coffee in a coffee pot, and checked the toast in the toaster. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and toasted bread filled the sunny kitchen, where family photos hung on the walls, smiles from the beach, Christmas cards, school parties. Mark, a 42-year-old mid-level manager at an company, had the look of a man who was used to being in control. Tall, with a touch of gray in his dark hair and a good-natured smile, he was what his colleagues called a reliable guy. His life revolved around family, work, and annual trips to the seaside, where he taught his children to build sandcastles and collect seashells at dawn. "Sophie, Luke, come down. The eggs are getting cold," Mark shouted, not looking up from the frying pan. There was a clatter of feet from above, and a minute later Luke, a 10-year-old whirlwind with tousled blonde hair and an Avengers t-shirt, came running into the kitchen. He nearly knocked a stack of napkins off the table as he ran, but caught it deftly at the last moment and immediately tossed it aside, plopping down in his favorite chair by the window. "Dad, do we have any more peanut butter?" he asked, already pulling a jar out of the cabinet and spreading a thick layer on his crispy toast. Crumbs fell on the table, but Luke didn't care at all. He was chattering on about something else, periodically licking his knife and dipping it in the jar again. Outside the window, the morning sun was breaking through the green branches of the apple tree. The day promised to be ordinary, calm, and Mark, watching the children, thought for a moment that it should always be like this. "Dad, can I borrow your old tablet today? I want to show the kids at school a new game," Luke said with his mouth full, waving his toast like a conductor's baton. Mark turned, wiping his hands on his apron that read "King of the Grill," and raised an eyebrow. "Luke, how many times have I told you not to talk with your mouth full? And yes, you can have the tablet, but only if you promise not to break it like last time." Luke rolled his eyes but nodded, swallowing a piece of toast. At that moment, Sophie, the Petersons' 14-year-old daughter, walked into the kitchen. Her long brown hair was pulled back into a messy bun, and small star-shaped earrings glittered in her ears. She was holding her phone, her fingers moving quickly across the screen as she typed out a message. "Good morning, Sophie." Mark placed a plate of scrambled eggs and fried bacon in front of her. "Would you mind putting your phone down for at least 5 minutes?" Sophie looked up, frowning slightly, but still put the phone in the pocket of her jeans. "Morning, Dad. Where's Mom?" Her voice was a little sharper than usual, with a slight hint of irritation. Mark froze for a second, but then smiled, trying not to show his concern. "Mom's already left for work. She has an early meeting," he replied, although he wasn't sure if it was true. Emily Peterson, a 39-year-old financial advisor, had become something of an enigma in recent months, even to her husband. She had always been ambitious, with a sharp mind and a knack for charming people. Her career at the investment firm Miller and Associates had been on the rise, especially since she had been assigned Jason Miller, a charismatic widower with a reputation for getting his way. Emily often spoke of him with admiration, describing him as a brilliant strategist and someone who sees opportunity where others see risk. Mark, who had grown to trust his wife, had tried to ignore it, but in recent weeks her behavior had begun to bother him. She came home later than usual, citing urgent projects and unscheduled meetings. Her phone, which had previously been charging in the living room, was now always with her even at night, when she checked her messages, hiding the screen from the light, thinking Mark was asleep. Mark tried to convince himself that it was just work, that Emily was engrossed in a new project. but something deep inside him whispered that it was not that simple. He often found himself leaning in to kiss her before bed, smelling someone else's perfume that hadn't been there that morning, or noticing a thin white envelope with a company logo on the armrest of their family SUV, which she quickly stuffed into her bag. "Dad, what's wrong?" Luke's voice pulled Mark out of his heavy thoughts. He had already finished his toast and was now trying to reach for a pack of cereal. "You're going to overcook your eggs again." "Huh? What?" Mark blinked, shaking off the illusion. He quickly flipped the eggs onto the plate and smiled at his son. "Everything is under control, boss," he muttered, trying to sound cheerful. At that moment, the light click of heels was heard in the hallway. Emily was coming down. She entered the kitchen almost silently in a perfectly ironed light pantsuit, with her hair pulled back into a bun and fresh gloss on her lips. On her face was a tired but determined smile, the same businesslike one. "Good morning," she said, kissing Mark on the cheek so quickly that he didn't have time to really feel the kiss. "Mom, are you singing with us?" Luke looked up, breaking into a wide smile. Emily glanced at her son, then at Sophie, who had hidden behind her book again and was already reaching into her bag, taking out her phone. "Just coffee. I have a meeting in 40 minutes," she answered so matter-of-factly that Mark felt cold despite the heat of the stove. He placed her favorite mug in front of her with a faded picture of a lighthouse, bought many years ago for her first trip to the sea. "Do you want some eggs? There's some left." "Thanks, I won't make it," Emily said, not looking up from her phone. For a second, the corners of her lips twitched, as if she wanted to add something, but changed her mind. Mark watched silently as she sipped her coffee and quickly typed something. There was neither the tiredness of a mother nor the gentleness of a wife in her face, only the concentration of a professional whose thoughts were already elsewhere. He felt that heavy, dull feeling in his chest again, as if something important was slipping through his fingers, just like a drop of water rolling off a marble countertop. "Dad, you're lost in thought again." Luke's voice brought Mark back to reality. The boy was looking at him, holding a glass of orange juice. "You always do that when you make eggs." Mark laughed, patting his son on the head. "Just thinking about how to make your eggs even more delicious. Maybe add a secret ingredient." "Not your secret pepper," Sophie snorted, but the corners of her lips twitched into a smile. "Last time I thought my mouth was going to burst into flames." The kitchen filled with laughter, and for a moment everything seemed perfect. But Mark couldn't shake the feeling that behind the facade of their family happiness, something was starting to crack at the seams. After the kids left for school, Mark was alone in the house. He poured himself another cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, looking at a photograph on the wall. It was of the four of them, him, Emily, Sophie, and Luke, standing on the beach in Malibu, laughing and hugging each other. That had been 2 years ago, when everything had still seemed simple and clear. Emily had looked at him with such love then that he felt like the happiest man in the world. Now that she was home, her gaze seemed absent-minded, as if her mind was somewhere else. Mark pulled out his phone and opened their shared chat. The last message from Emily was from last night. "I'll be late, don't wait up." He started to type, "Hey, how are you? Maybe we can have dinner tonight?" But stopped. Something told him that the answer would be as short and evasive as always. He sighed and put the phone away. The Petersons' home was their pride and joy. 2 stories, 4 bedrooms, a spacious living room with a fireplace, and a backyard with a gazebo where he and Emily had once dreamed of hosting barbecues for friends. They had bought the house 10 years ago, when Sophie was 4 and Luke was just starting to walk. Back then, he and Emily had spent their evenings planning the future: how Sophie would play on the school basketball team, how Luke would become an engineer, how they themselves would travel the world when the kids were older. But now those dreams seemed distant, as if they belonged to another couple. Mark stood up, wanting to distract himself from his dark thoughts. He walked out into the backyard, where the swing creaked slightly in the wind. In the distance, he could hear the barking of a neighbor's dog and the hum of a lawn mower. Life in Millsboro went on as usual, but for Mark it seemed frozen, waiting for something inevitable to happen. Emily returned home in the evening, when the sun had already set and the house was lit by soft lamplight. Mark was sitting in the living room, leafing through work documents, but his mind was elsewhere. Hearing the sound of the door opening, he got up from the sofa. "Emily?" he called, trying to keep his voice casual. She walked into the living room, still dressed in a formal suit, a navy blue jacket, and pencil skirt. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a neat bun, but a few strands were out of place, making her look a little tired. She was holding her phone in her hand, which she quickly put away in her bag when she noticed Mark looking at her. "Hi, honey," she smiled, but it was a strained smile. "Sorry, it's been a crazy day. Jason called an impromptu meeting, and we were up until the last minute discussing a new project." "Jason again?" Mark tried to joke, but there was a note in his voice he didn't expect. "He seems to be taking up all your time." Emily froze, her eyes narrowing for a moment, but she quickly laughed, waving it off. "Oh, Mark, don't start. You know how it works. If you want to grow in your career, you have to give it your all." She walked up to him, placing her hand on his shoulder. Her touch was warm but distant, as if she was doing it out of habit. "Are you okay?" Mark asked, looking into her eyes. He hoped to see something familiar in them, something that would remind him of the Emily who had once promised to be with him through thick and thin. "Sure," she said, looking away. "I'm just tired. I'm going to take a shower and go to bed. Tomorrow is another long day." She kissed him on the cheek, quickly, almost mechanically, and headed upstairs. Mark stood in the middle of the living room, listening to her footsteps fade away on the stairs. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that this was just fatigue, just work. But deep down, he felt that something had changed, and that something scared him more than he was willing to admit. The dim light from the backyard lantern cast long shadows on the wooden fence as Mark Peterson sat on the porch, a mug of cold tea in his hands. It was past midnight, and the house behind him was silent, as if holding its breath. Sophie and Luke were long asleep, their second-floor rooms in darkness, but Mark and Emily's bedroom remained empty. Emily was late again. "Meeting," she had written in a short text 2 hours ago. Mark had read it a dozen times, trying to catch a hint of truth in the dry words. But the text was as cold as the autumn wind rustling the leaves on the lawn. He leaned back in the old wicker chair he and Emily had bought at a garage sale early in their marriage. They had laughed and argued about whether the country wreck would fit into their new suburban home. Now it creaked under his weight, and the memories of those days felt like a faded photograph he wanted to tuck away in a drawer. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping through his fingers like sand, and that something had to do with Emily. That morning, he decided to talk to her. Not to accuse her, not to make a scene, just to talk. He'd rehearsed the lines in his head while he'd driven Luke to soccer practice, while he'd been sorting through emails at work, while he'd been making dinner. He wanted to be calm, understanding, the Mark everyone loved for his level-headedness. But now, sitting alone on the porch, he felt a knot of anxiety growing inside him that he couldn't ignore. The morning started with the usual bustle, but there was tension in the air. Luke, as always, was running around the house looking for a lost sock, and Sophie was sitting at the table, her nose buried in a bowl of cereal and her headphones. Mark was making coffee, trying not to look at the clock. Emily appeared in the kitchen when he was already pouring the drink into cups. Her dark green dress emphasized her slender figure, and her heels clicked on the parquet, betraying her haste. She looked collected, but there were shadows under her eyes that even light makeup did not hide. "Good morning," she said, grabbing her bag from the kitchen island. "I'm late, Mark, sorry. I have to be at the office by 9. Mark set the coffee pot down and turned to face her. His heart was beating faster, but he forced himself to smile. "Emily, wait a minute. Can we talk?" His voice was soft, almost pleading. She froze, holding her bag in one hand and her phone in the other. Her eyebrows rose slightly and something like irritation flickered in her eyes. "Right now, I literally have 5 minutes." She glanced at her phone screen as if checking the time, though Mark noticed her finger quickly swiping away the notification. "It's important." He stepped closer, trying to catch her eye. I just, I feel like we barely see each other. You're always at work, and I'm starting to worry. Emily sighed, setting her bag down on the chair. She crossed her arms over her chest, her posture becoming almost defensive. Mark, I explained it to you. We have a new project. Jason is pushing for everything to be perfect. You know how it works in my industry. If I don't give it my all, I'll be passed over. Her tone was sharp, and Mark felt the words he had chosen so carefully disappear into thin air. He tried again. I understand, work is important, but even at home, you're somewhere else. You never let go of your phone, you come home late. I just want to know if everything is okay with us. Emily looked at him, and for a second her face softened. She stepped forward, placing her hand on his forearm. Mark, it's okay. Really, I'm just really busy. Let's not make a big deal out of nothing, okay? She smiled, but it was a tight smile, like she was trying to convince not just him, but herself as well. He nodded, though his insides twisted. He wanted to say more, to ask about the messages she hid, the calls she dropped when he was around. But instead he kept quiet, afraid the truth would be worse than his doubts. Okay, he said quietly. Just, let me know if something's wrong, okay? Of course, she replied, already turning away. I have to go. See you in the evening. She grabbed her bag and walked out, leaving behind a light trail of perfume and a feeling of emptiness. Mark watched her until the front door slammed shut, and only then noticed Sophie watching him from behind the desk. Her headphones were lying on the table, and there was something in her eyes that he couldn't decipher, either pity or irritation. What? He asked, trying to smile. Nothing, Sophie shrugged and put her headphones back on. You're just always so patient. She said the word as if it were both a compliment and a reproach. Mark found nothing to say in response and simply turned to the sink to busy his hands with washing dishes. It would be interesting to know where you are watching us from, and be sure to tell us if you have had any funny incidents like this. The day passed in a routine. At work, Mark was buried in spreadsheets and reports, but his thoughts kept returning to the morning conversation. He went over Emily's every word, every move, trying to figure out where he had gone wrong. Was he pushing too hard? Was she really just tired? He thought back to their first years together, dancing to the radio in the tiny kitchen of their first apartment, laughing at his attempts to cook pasta, making plans for the future while cuddling on the old couch. Back then, he had felt needed, loved. Now, more and more, he felt like a shadow in her life. By the time he got home that evening, the house was quiet. Sophie had gone to see a friend, Luke was at after school, and Emily, as expected, had texted again, going to be late, meeting with Jason. Mark looked at the message from his living room couch and felt something heavy, almost physical, growing inside him. He pictured her in the office, at the long table across from Jason Miller, the charismatic widower Emily spoke of with such admiration. Mark had never met him, but in his mind's eye, Jason was tall, confident, with a perfect smile and an expensive watch on his wrist. A man who could give Emily what Mark, with his stable but boring job as a manager, could not. He stood up and went into the kitchen to pour himself a glass of water, but stopped at the window, looking out at the dark courtyard. His reflection in the glass looked tired, older. Maybe it was my fault, he thought. Had he become too predictable, too ordinary? Was Emily simply tired of his routine, of trying to do everything right? He remembered how last month she had brushed off his offer of a weekend together, citing her busy schedule. He hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now every moment seemed like a piece of a puzzle he was afraid to put together. The sound of the door opening made him jump. He turned, expecting to see Emily, but it was Sophie, back from her friends. Her backpack was slung casually over one shoulder, and she was holding her phone. "Mom's not here again?" she asked, without looking at him, and threw her backpack on the floor. "She's in a meeting," Mark answered, trying to keep his voice calm. Sophie snorted as she opened the refrigerator. "At the meeting, of course," she muttered, taking out a bottle of juice. "As always." Mark wanted to ask what she meant, but something in her tone stopped him. Instead, he simply said, "Dinner is in the oven. Do you want me to heat it up? No, I'm not hungry. Sophie headed for the stairs, but stopped. Dad, you're not blind, are you? Her words hung in the air, sharp as shards of glass. Mark looked at his daughter, unsure of what to say. She didn't wait, just turned and walked into her room, leaving him alone with the silence and his own thoughts. He returned to the porch, where his mug of tea, now quite cold, still sat. Somewhere in the distance, a siren began to wail, and Mark thought that perhaps that was the sound of his family, slowly but surely beginning to crumble. The day was gray and chilly, with low clouds that seemed to weigh down Millsboro with all their weight. Mark Peterson was driving home earlier than usual because a client had canceled at the last minute, leaving him with an unexpectedly free evening. He turned the wheel of his old Honda Accord, listening to the radio, where the host was enthusiastically talking about a new restaurant downtown. But Mark's mind was elsewhere, swirling around Emily, her distant gaze, her short texts, her constant meetings. He tried to convince himself that this was all temporary, that she was simply overworked. But each new day brought more doubts, like rust, eating away at his confidence. The streetlights were already on when he turned onto their street, casting a soft orange glow on the wet pavement. The Petersons' house was cozy despite the dreary weather, with light streaming through the large windows from the living room and a string of lights on the porch that Luke had insisted on last year swinging. Mark pulled to the curb, turned off the engine, and stood in the car for a moment, looking at the house. Something told him that today would be different, though he couldn't explain where the feeling came from. He got out of the car, adjusted the collar of his coat, and headed for the front door, but stopped when he saw two figures through the living room window. Emily was sitting on the couch, holding a glass of red wine, and across from her, in a chair, sat Ruth, her friend from college. Ruth was Emily's opposite. Short, with short red hair and a habit of speaking loudly, she always struck Mark as too direct, almost rude. But Emily appreciated her honesty and the fact that Ruth was always there when she needed support. Mark froze, wondering why his hand did not reach for the doorknob. Something in their postures, in the way Emily leaned forward and Ruth gestured, made him wary. He took a step to the side, closer to the window, trying to remain unnoticed. He could hear muffled voices through the thin crack in the curtains. Mark knew it was wrong to eavesdrop, a breach of trust, but his feet were rooted to the spot. He held his breath, listening to snatches of conversation. "It's time, Emily. You can't hide this forever." Ruth's voice was insistent, almost pleading. "He deserves to know the truth." Emily shook her head, her fingers nervously clenching the stem of her glass. "You don't understand, Ruth. It's not that easy. I tried. I really tried to stop." Mark felt the blood drain from his face. His heart was pounding so hard he was afraid they would hear him through the window. What was she talking about? What was she trying to stop? He pressed himself closer to the wall, trying to catch every word. "Tried?" Ruth snorted, leaning back in her chair. "Emily, you've been living a double life for over a year now. This isn't trying. This is betrayal. End it, for God's sake. Tell Mark, or I'll do it myself." Mark froze. The word betrayal hit him like a hammer. He wanted to storm into the house, to demand an explanation, but his legs refused to move. His mind clung to the hope that he had misunderstood, that this was just a misunderstanding, that Ruth was talking about something else, work, gossip, anything but what his imagination was currently picturing. "You won't do this," Emily's voice shook, anger and fear mixed in it. "This is my life, Ruth. Mine, and I'll decide when and how to tell him." When, Emily? When will he find out for himself? When will Sophie or Luke start asking questions? Ruth slammed her glass down on the table so hard that the wine almost spilled. "You can see he already suspects. Mark is no fool." Emily was silent, looking at the floor. Her shoulders slumped, and for a moment she looked less like the confident woman who always seemed in control and more like a lost, almost broken woman. Mark looked at her through the window, his heart torn between wanting to hug her and demanding the truth. He couldn't wait any longer. His hand went to the doorknob, and he stepped into the house, trying to keep his composure. The door creaked, and both women started, turning to look at him. Emily went pale, her eyes wide, while Ruth sat up straighter, as if preparing for a fight. "Mark," Emily jumped up from the couch, spilling some wine on the carpet. You're supposed to be at work." The client canceled the meeting. His voice was calm, but inside he was seething. He looked at Ruth, then at Emily, and the words he'd been holding back for so long burst out. "What's going on? What do you need to tell me?" Emily opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her eyes darted between Mark and Ruth, as if she were looking for salvation. Ruth, on the other hand, looked determined. She stood up, crossed her arms, and spoke first. "Mark, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for you to find out like this, but—" She took a deep breath, her voice shaking as she continued. "Emily's been dating Jason, her boss, for over a year now." Time seemed to stand still. Mark felt the floor slipping away from under his feet. He looked at Ruth, at her serious face, then at Emily, expecting her to laugh, to say that it was a joke, that Ruth had made it all up. But Emily was silent, her lips trembling, and tears glistening in her eyes. "That's not true," she finally managed, but her voice was weak, almost a whisper. "Ruth, how can you?" "Enough, Emily," Ruth raised her voice, her patience snapping. "I'm tired of covering for you. You promised you'd stop, but nothing's changed. He needs to know." Mark stepped forward, his hands clenched into fists, but he forced himself to speak calmly. "Emily, tell me she's lying. Right now. Look me in the eyes and tell me it's not true." Emily looked up, and in that moment, Mark understood without words. Her eyes, which he loved so much, were now full of guilt and pain. She opened her mouth, but instead of a denial, a quiet sob escaped. "Mark, I didn't mean for this to happen." She covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking. "It didn't start right away. I didn't plan it. It just happened." "It just happened?" His voice broke, and he felt the anger he'd been suppressing for so long begin to bubble up. "You've been sleeping with another man for over a year, and it just happened." Ruth turned away, looking out the window as if she didn't want to be part of this scene. Emily dropped her hands, her face wet with tears, but she forced herself to speak. "You stopped noticing me, Mark." Her voice was full of despair, but there was anger in it too. "You were busy with the kids, with work, with this house. I felt invisible. And Jason, he saw me. He made me feel wanted, alive. I didn't want it, but I couldn't stop." Mark looked at her, and every word she said was like a blow. He wanted to scream, to argue, to say that it was she who had become distant, that it was she who had started hiding her phone and coming home after midnight. But instead, he felt something inside him breaking not with a bang, but quietly, almost imperceptibly, like a thin crack in glass that was about to widen further. "Do you blame me?" His voice was hoarse, almost alien. "Do you really think it's my fault that you cheated on me for over a year?" "I don't blame you." Emily took a step toward him, but he stepped back and she froze. I tried to tell you. I wanted to stop, but every time I tried, He what?" Mark raised his voice, and Ruth flinched, turning to face them. "He forced you? He threatened you?" "No," Emily shook her head, her voice quieter. "He wasn't threatening. He was kind to me. He listened to me, and I fell in love." The word, "in love," hung in the air like poison. Mark felt his throat tighten, and for a moment he thought he couldn't breathe. He looked at his wife, the woman he'd lived with for 16 years, the woman he'd raised his children with, the woman he'd built this house with, and he didn't recognize her. This wasn't Emily, not the one who'd laughed at his jokes and held his hand as they walked along the beach. "Get out," he said quietly, but there was steel in his voice. "Both of you. Right now." Ruth tried to say something, but Mark raised his hand, stopping her. "I said, get out." Emily looked at him, her eyes full of tears, but she didn't move. Ruth sighed softly, grabbed her bag, and headed for the door. She stopped at the threshold, turning around. "Mark, I'm really sorry. I didn't mean for this to happen." He didn't answer, and Ruth walked out, leaving them alone. Emily took a step toward him, her hand reaching for his shoulder, but he drew back. "Don't touch me," he said, his voice shaking with pain. "Just go away. I need to think." Emily nodded, wiping away tears. She grabbed her bag and walked out, leaving Mark alone in the living room. He stood in the middle of the room, looking at the glasses of wine, the stain on the carpet, the garland outside the window, still swaying in the wind. Everything was the same as it had been an hour ago, but now it was a different house, a different life, and he didn't know how to live in it anymore. The silence in the Peterson house was deafening, as if someone had turned off the volume on the world. Mark stood in the middle of the living room where, just minutes before, his life had shattered. The glasses of wine Emily and Ruth had left behind were still on the coffee table, and the stain on the carpet was a reminder of the scene that had just unfolded. He stared at it, trying to hold on to something real, something tangible, to keep from drowning in the chaos of his thoughts. The door Emily had slammed behind him as she left still echoed in his head, but he knew she would come back. She always did, only now he wasn't sure he wanted her to. Mark sank down on the couch, his hands falling limply into his lap. He felt as if someone had ripped his heart out and left him with an empty shell. The anger that had flared when he heard Ruth's confession had now receded, replaced by a cold, oppressive ache. He repeated Emily's words over and over, "I'm in love." It wasn't just a betrayal, it wasn't just an infidelity, it was the destruction of everything he believed in. 16 years of marriage, 2 children, countless evenings spent together talking, laughing, making plans. It had all been an illusion, as fragile as glass that had just shattered. He didn't know how long he sat there, staring into space. Maybe an hour, maybe two. The light in the living room grew dimmer, the shadows lengthened, and the porch lights continued to flicker, as if mocking his grief. The sound of a key in the lock made him jump. The door opened, and Emily appeared. Her eyes were red from crying, her hair was disheveled, and her coat hung on her shoulders as if she had put it on in a hurry. She paused, looking at Mark, and there was so much pain in her gaze that for a moment he felt a pang of pity. But only for a moment. "Mark," her voice was hoarse, almost pleading, "we need to talk." He looked up slowly, his face motionless like a mask. "Talk?" His voice was cold, almost alien. "You think, after everything I've heard, we have nothing to talk about?" Emily took a step forward, but stopped when she saw him tense up. She clasped her hands together as if trying to find support in them. "I know how you feel right now," she began, her voice shaking. "And I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But please, hear me out. I don't want it to end like this." Mark was silent, his eyes boring into hers, but he didn't interrupt. He wanted to hear what she had to say, even though every cell in his body screamed at her to go away. Emily took a deep breath and sank into the chair opposite her, her fingers fiddling nervously with the hem of her coat. "It didn't start because I didn't love you," she said quietly. "I've always loved you, Mark. I still do. But I felt unwanted, invisible. You were so perfect, always taking care of the kids, the house, your work. You were like a rock I could lean on. But I stopped feeling like a woman. I was just a wife, a mother, part of this perfect picture we created for the neighbors." She fell silent, looking at the floor as if she was afraid to meet his gaze. Mark felt his throat tighten, but he forced himself to remain silent. He wanted her to continue, to spill everything, even if every word was like a knife. "When Jason became my boss, everything changed," Emily continued, her voice a little firmer, but still hurt. He saw me, not just an employee, not just a mother or a wife. He looked at me in a way you haven't in years. He listened to me, interested in my ideas, my dreams. And I came alive. I felt wanted again, alive. It was like a breath of air after I'd been suffocating for so long." Mark clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. He wanted to scream that it was a lie, that he had always noticed her, that he had done everything to make her happy. But deep down, he knew there was some truth to her words. He had been so consumed with his role husband, father, breadwinner, that he had perhaps stopped seeing her as a woman. But that didn't excuse her. Nothing could excuse a year of lies. And you decided that cheating was the way out? His voice was low, almost growling. You decided that sleeping with another man, lying to me, to our children, is what will make you alive. Emily winced, her eyes filling with tears again. She shook her head as if trying to shake off his words. I didn't mean for it to go this far, she said, her voice breaking. It started with conversations, with dinners after work. I thought I could keep it under control. But then I realized I was falling in love with him. And I hated myself for it, Mark. I tried to stop, but every time I tried to leave, he found a way to bring me back. He was so convincing. He told me I deserved more, that I deserved to be happy. Happy? Mark almost shouted, getting up from the couch. You were happy with me. We had a family, Emily. We had Sophie and Luke, this house, our life. And you threw it all away for some rich widower who apparently knows how to say the right words. Emily stood up too, her eyes flashing. For the first time in the entire conversation, there was anger in her voice. Don't you dare make me out to be a monster, she said, her voice shaking but strong. Do you think it was easy? Do you think I didn't struggle with myself every day? I knew I was hurting you, that I was destroying our family. But I couldn't stop because I was afraid of going back to the emptiness that was before him. Mark looked at her, anger and despair warring in his chest. He wanted to hate her, wanted to see her as nothing but a traitor, but her words, her tears, her pain, it was all too real. He saw that she was suffering, but that didn't lessen his own pain. On the contrary, it made it even more acute. You fell in love with him, he said slowly, as if tasting the words. Do you still love him? Emily fell silent, her gaze lowered. The silence was an answer, and it hit Mark harder than any confession. He turned away, unable to look at her any longer. His gaze fell on the photograph on the mantelpiece, the four of them on the beach, laughing, happy. Now the photograph seemed mocking. I want you to go, he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. Move to Ruth's, or your Jason's. I don't care, but I don't want you in this house. Emily gasped, her hand reaching out to him, but he pulled back. Mark, please, her voice was full of desperation. Don't do that. We can fix anything. For Sophie's sake, for Luke's sake. Don't you dare mention the kids, he snapped, and she fell silent as if she'd been slapped. Did you think about them when you slept with him? Did you think about them when you lied to me every day? Emily buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs. Mark looked at her, and part of him wanted to hold her, to comfort her, like he had done hundreds of times in their life together. But another part, big, cold, furious, wouldn't let him move. Pack your things, he said, his voice hollow as an echo. I don't want the kids to see you like this, and I don't want them to know yet. Emily nodded, wiping away her tears. She walked slowly up the stairs, and Mark heard her opening the closet, things rustling. He stayed in the living room, looking at the stain on the carpet, and felt his world crumble completely. The house grew even quieter once Emily was gone. Mark sat on the couch, his thoughts swirling like autumn leaves in the wind. He thought about divorce, a word that had always seemed distant, foreign, meant for other people. But now it stood before him like an inevitability. He imagined explaining everything to Sophie and Luke, the way their faces would change when they learned that their family was no longer a family. He was afraid of their pain, their questions, their accusations. He was afraid that they would hate him for not being able to keep their mother. Or worse, that they would hate her. Mark stood up and walked into the kitchen, where the smell of morning coffee still lingered. He opened the refrigerator, but quickly closed it, realizing he didn't want to eat. He didn't want anything, not food, not sleep, not conversation. He wanted to go back to a time when everything was simple, when Emily looked at him with love, not guilt. But time doesn't turn back, and he knew that better than anyone. He went up to the bedroom, where there was a note from Emily on the bed. I'm at Ruth's. Call me when you're ready to talk. I love you. Mark crumpled the paper and threw it in the hamper. He lay down on the bed, still dressed, and stared at the ceiling. He couldn't sleep, but his mind kept spinning, painting grim pictures of the future. court cases, dividing up property, fighting over the kids. He thought about Sophie, who was starting to suspect something, and about Luke, who still believed their family was unbreakable. He thought about Jason Miller, the faceless man who had stolen his wife, his life. And he thought about himself, about who he would be when this was all over. The night dragged on endlessly, and Mark lay listening to the clock ticking in the hallway. For the first time in 16 years, he felt completely alone. The dark clouds over Millsboro had parted, giving way to a pale autumn sun, but for Mark Peterson, the world remained gray. It had been a week since the night Emily had left, leaving him alone with the silence of the house and the searing truth of her betrayal. He tried to hold on for Sophie and Luke, making them breakfast, driving them to practices and school clubs, but every step he took was saturated with fatigue, as if someone had drained all the energy from him. The children noticed that something was wrong. Sophie had become more silent, her eyes full of questions she did not dare ask, and Luke, on the contrary, tried to lighten the mood with jokes, but his laughter sounded unnatural, like a cracked bell. Mark lay awake at night. He lay in his and Emily's bedroom, still smelling of her perfume, and turned her words over in his head. I felt useless. He tried to figure out where he'd gone wrong, at what point their life, which had seemed so solid, had begun to fall apart. But the more he thought about it, the clearer it became that the truth wasn't in the past, but in the present, in her lies, in her secrets, in her love for another man. And he knew he couldn't just sit and wait for her to decide what to do with their marriage. He had to act. On Monday morning, Mark took the day off from work, citing family reasons. He put on his best suit, the dark gray one Emily had once picked out for him, and headed downtown to the office of a family lawyer. Richard Clark's office was in an old building with tall windows and creaky wooden floors. Richard, a man in his 50s with a neat beard and piercing eyes, greeted Mark with a warm but professional smile. "Mr. Peterson, sit down." Richard pointed to a leather chair opposite the massive oak table. "Tell me what brings you here." Mark sat up, his hands growing clammy with nerves. He didn't know where to begin, how to turn the chaos of his emotions into a coherent story. But he forced himself to talk, starting with the night he'd overheard Emily and Ruth talking. He told her about her confession, about Jason, about the year of lies that had turned his world upside down. Richard listened intently, making notes on his pad, his face calm but his eyes flickering with sympathy. "I want a divorce," Mark said when he finished. His voice was firm, but inside he could feel every cell shaking. "But I don't want the kids to suffer. And I don't know what to do with the property, the house, all of it." Richard nodded, putting his pen down. "Divorce is a complicated process, especially when there are children and joint property. We need to gather as much information about your finances as possible to ensure a fair division. Do you have access to your joint accounts?" Mark nodded, though the thought of money made him feel sick. He had never been one to watch every penny that had always been Emily's territory. As a financial advisor, she had taken charge of their savings, their investments, even their mortgage. He trusted her. Completely. "Okay," Richard continued. "I recommend you start by checking all your bank accounts, credit cards, and any financial transactions from the last couple of years." Sometimes in these situations, he hesitated, choosing his words. Unexpected details emerge. Mark frowned, not quite understanding what the lawyer meant. But he agreed to provide all the documents he had: bank statements, tax returns, even the passwords to their shared online banking. Richard promised to look into everything and set up a follow-up meeting in a few days. As Mark left the office, he felt a strange sense of relief. Not that the problem had been solved, but that he had taken the first step. But that relief was quickly replaced by a new wave of anxiety. What if Emily was hiding something other than her feelings? 3 days later, Mark was sitting in Richard's office again, and this time the atmosphere was different. The lawyer looked more serious, his brows were furrowed, and there was a folder of bank statements on his desk. Mark immediately noticed that something was wrong. "I've looked at your finances," Richard began, opening the folder. "Overall, everything looks stable. The mortgage is being paid on time, The kids' college savings are intact. But there's one thing that's alarming me. He slid a sheet of paper with highlighted lines toward Mark. It was a statement for their joint account, and among the usual transactions, utility bills, grocery shopping, Luke's training fees, there were several transfers to an unfamiliar account. Every month since last year, $2,000 or $3,000 have been leaving their account. The purpose of payment column read investments. Emily never mentioned these transfers, Richard asked, looking at Mark over his glasses. Mark shook his head, his throat tight. He remembered Emily sometimes talking about new investment opportunities that she discussed with Jason, but he never went into detail. He trusted her. There was that word again, trust. It sounded like a joke now. It's her personal account, Richard continued. I checked. She opened it about a year and a half ago, and these transfers go there regularly. In total, about $30,000 went in a year. Mark felt the blood rush to his face. 30,000. It was their money, their shared savings, which they had been saving for their children's future, for home improvements, for their dreams. And she was transferring it to her account without telling him a word. Why did she do it? He asked, though the answer was already beginning to form in his head. Richard shrugged, but his gaze was heavy. It could be anything from trying to hide income to preparing for independent living. We can't know for sure until we do a deeper investigation. I'd recommend hiring a private investigator. If you're going to file for divorce, we'll need evidence not only of her infidelity, but of any financial irregularities. Mark nodded, his thoughts racing. Detective. The word sounded like something out of a cheesy sitcom, but it was becoming part of his reality now. He didn't want to dig into Emily's life, but he had no choice. If she was lying about money, what else was she lying about? The next day, Mark met with a private detective named Paul Winters, who had been recommended by Richard. Paul was a short man with a sharp gaze and a habit of speaking in short, clipped sentences. His office was in a nondescript building on the outskirts of town, and everything about it, from the worn leather couch to the smell of old coffee, screamed that this was a man who had seen too many secrets. "What do you want?" Paul asked, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms. Mark told everything, about Emily's betrayal, about Jason, about the strange transfers. He felt awkward, laying out his life in front of a stranger, but Paul listened without emotion, only nodding occasionally. "Got it," he said when Mark finished. "I can keep an eye on her. Photos, videos, texts, if I can. Give me a week, but it's not cheap." Mark agreed without a bargain. The money he would spend on a detective was nothing compared to what Emily had already siphoned off from their shared budget. He signed the contract, handed Paul a photo of Emily and her office address, and left feeling both determined and drained. A week later, Paul called and asked to meet at a small cafe in the city center. Mark arrived early, taking a table by the window. His fingers nervously tapped the rim of his coffee cup as he waited. When Paul walked in, holding a thin folder, Mark felt his heart clench. He knew what he was about to see, but he still wasn't prepared. Paul sat down across from her and opened the folder without further ado. The first thing he saw was a photograph. Emily and Jason were leaving a restaurant, his arm around her waist, and she was smiling in a way she hadn't smiled at home in years. Another photograph showed them kissing in a car, a black Mercedes that was Jason's, apparently. Mark looked at the pictures, and each one was like a punch to the solar plexus. "That's not all," Paul said, pushing the printouts of the correspondence towards him. "I got it through her cloud account. She wasn't particularly security conscious." Mark took the sheets, his hands shaking. The messages were short, but each word burned. "Jason, I need you. I can't think of anything else." Emily, "Me too. But I'm scared. Mark is starting to get suspicious." Jason, "Then leave him. We can start over." Emily, "I don't know how. He's a good man. And the children." Mark put the pages down without finishing reading. He didn't need more. He already knew everything he needed to get a divorce. Evidence of infidelity, evidence of financial fraud, all of it now lay before him, neatly collected in a folder. but instead of satisfaction, he felt only emptiness. "Thank you," he said quietly, looking at Paul. "Is that all?" "Everything you asked for," Paul replied. "If you need more, let me know." Mark nodded, but he knew he didn't need more. He paid Paul, picked up the folder, and walked out of the cafe. It was cold outside, and the wind was blowing dry leaves along the sidewalk. Mark stood there clutching the folder, thinking about how far their marriage had come from the love he and Emily had once shared. When Mark got home, he hid the file in his desk drawer, locking it. He didn't want Sophie or Luke to stumble upon it. They already sensed that something was wrong. Sophie had become even more withdrawn, spending her evenings in her room with headphones on, while Luke, on the other hand, clung to Mark, asking questions he didn't know how to answer. When is Mum coming home? Why is she staying with Aunt Ruth? That night, after the kids were asleep, Mark sat in the kitchen with a glass of whiskey. He rarely drank, but today he needed something to numb the pain. He thought about how to tell the kids the truth. He imagined their faces Sophie, who might already have guessed, and Luke, for whom their family was still whole. He was afraid the truth would destroy them, but he was even more afraid of the lie that had already destroyed him. He decided he wasn't ready yet. Not today. Not tomorrow. But he knew this moment was inevitable. He finished his whiskey, put the glass in the sink, and went to bed, even though he knew sleep would never come again. Tomorrow he would call Richard and begin the divorce process. Tomorrow he would start a new life without Emily, without their past, without illusions. But today he just wanted the pain to go away, even for a minute. The autumn evening had settled into a soft dusk over Millsboro, and in the Peterson house the light from the kitchen was the only warm spot in the cold silence. Mark stood at the stove, stirring pasta sauce, but his movements were mechanical, almost mindless. The aroma of garlic and tomatoes filled the kitchen, but it did not bring the comfort it was accustomed to. Tonight was different, the first dinner without Emily in years. Her absence was felt not just at the table, but in every corner of the house. In the empty chair in the living room, in the silence of the bedroom, in the absence of her laughter that had once filled these walls. Mark knew that he could no longer put off talking to his children. The truth lay like a stone on his heart, and he could not bear it alone. Sophie and Luke were upstairs in their rooms, but the silence in the house was deceptive. Mark sensed that Sophie knew more than she was letting on. Her eyes had become sharp, almost accusing, in recent days, and she avoided conversation, hiding behind headphones and a closed door. Luke, on the other hand, tried to fill the void with chatter about school and football practice, but his questions about his mother were becoming more insistent. Mark knew that the children deserved the truth, but the thought of destroying their world was almost unbearable. He turned off the stove and shouted, trying to keep his voice calm. "Sophie, Luke, dinner is ready. Come down." Luke's feet were heard almost immediately, and a minute later he came barreling into the kitchen, his blonde hair disheveled and a marker stain on his t-shirt. He plopped down on a chair, immediately grabbing a piece of bread from the basket. "Dad, did you make spaghetti?" "Awesome," he said, but his enthusiasm was a little forced, as if he was trying to cheer himself up. Sophie appeared a few seconds later, her steps slow, almost reluctant. She sat down across from Luke, not looking at Mark, and began fiddling with her phone. Her face was tense, her eyes slightly puffy, as if she'd recently cried. Mark felt a pang of guilt. He knew Sophie had heard his arguments with Emily, not all of them, but enough to put the pieces together. Her silence wasn't just teenage rebellion. It was pain she didn't know how to express. Mark placed the pasta plates in front of the children and sat at the head of the table. He looked at them, at Luke, who was enthusiastically twirling spaghetti around his fork, and at Sophie, who had barely touched her food and knew the moment had arrived. He cleared his throat, trying to find words that wouldn't crush them. "Guys," he began, his voice quiet but firm, "we need to talk. About Mom, and about what's happening to our family." Luke froze, his fork hovering in midair. Sophie looked up, a mixture of fear and weariness flickering in her eyes. She knew what she was about to hear, but she still tensed, as if bracing herself for a blow. "What's wrong with Mom?" Luke asked, his voice thinner than usual. "She'll be back, right? She's just staying with Aunt Ruth for a few days, like you said." Mark took a deep breath, feeling his throat tighten. He looked at Sophie, and her gaze sharp, almost challenging, let him know she had already guessed. He couldn't lie. Not now. "I'm not going to lie to you," he said, looking from one to the other. "Mom, she did something that hurt us all very badly. She was with another person, not just as a friend, and it had been going on for a long time." The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp as shards. Luke blinked, his face scrunching up as if he was trying to process what he'd just heard. Sophie, on the other hand, pressed her lips together, her fingers gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. "You mean she cheated on you?" Sophie's voice was cold, but there was anger in it. "With who? With that boss of hers, right? With Jason?" Mark nodded, speechless. He had expected Sophie to be shocked, but her reaction was different. She had been prepared for this. She knew, or at least suspected. "Sophie, how are you?" he began, but she interrupted him. "I heard you fighting," she said, her voice growing louder. "I heard her crying and you yelling at her, and I saw her hide her phone and the way she smiles when she thinks no one's looking. I'm not stupid, Dad. I knew something was wrong." Luke looked at his sister, his eyes wide with horror. "That's not true," he said, his voice shaking. "Mom's not like that. She wouldn't do that." "Luke," Mark reached out to touch his shoulder, but the boy flinched away, his eyes filling with tears. "I know it's hard. I didn't want to believe it myself. But it's true. And I don't know what we're supposed to do now, but I promise we'll get through this. Together." Together. Sophie snorted, her voice full of sarcasm. "Without her? She left us, Dad. She chose some rich idiot over us. How can you talk about together when she ruined everything?" Her words were like a slap in the face, but Mark couldn't blame her. He felt the same anger, the same rage that was now pouring out of his daughter. But he could see her pain, too, in the trembling of her lips, in the way she tried to hold back her tears. Sophie was only a teenager, but her world was crumbling just like his own. "Sophie," he said softly, "I know you're angry, and you have every right to be. But Mom, she's still your mom. She loves you, even if she did something terrible." "Love us?" Sophie jumped up from her chair creaking on the floor. "If she loved us, she wouldn't lie. She wouldn't run to her boss while we were waiting here for her like idiots. I hate her." She ran out of the kitchen, and a second later Mark heard her door slam. Luke remained seated, his face wet with tears, and the fork with the pasta still lay on the table, untouched. "Dad," he whispered, "is this because of me? Did I do something wrong?" Mark felt his heart tighten. He moved closer to his son, wrapping his arms around his shoulders. Luke didn't pull away, but pressed himself against him, his small body shaking. "No, Luke," Mark said, trying to keep his voice steady. "This isn't about you, and it's not about Sophie. This is between me and Mom. None of this is your fault. Do you hear me? None of this is your fault." Luke nodded, but his tears continued to fall onto the table. Mark held him, feeling his own eyes begin to burn. He wanted to be strong, wanted to be the rock Emily had talked about, but now he felt as lost as his children. Dinner passed in silence. Sophie didn't return, and Mark didn't call her. He knew she needed time. Luke finished his pasta, but without his usual enthusiasm, and soon went to his room, saying he wanted to play video games. Mark was left alone at the table, looking at the empty plates and cold sauce. It was their first family dinner without Emily, and he felt as if someone had cut a piece out of their lives and left a gaping hole. He cleared the dishes, moving slowly, as if afraid to disturb the silence. His thoughts returned to Sophie, to her anger, to her words. She blamed Emily, and Mark understood why. Sophie was old enough to see the cracks in their family, to notice how Emily was drifting away. But her anger wasn't just at her mother, it was at the world, which was not what she had expected. Mark was afraid that this anger would stay with her, that it would poison her, as it poisoned him. Later, when the house was dark, Mark knocked on Sophie's door. She didn't answer, but he went in anyway. She was lying on her bed, her head buried in her pillow, her headphones in but no music playing. He sat on the edge of the bed, unsure of what to say. "Sophie," he began quietly, "I know how you feel, and I'm not going to tell you that everything will be okay, because right now it's not. But I'm here, and Luke is here. We're your family, and we'll get through this." She turned her head. Her eyes were red, but already dry. "I don't want her to come back," she said, her voice firm but brittle. "She betrayed us, all of us." Mark nodded without arguing. He didn't know what would happen next, but in that moment he realized one thing. His daughter was stronger than he thought, and perhaps it was her strength that would help them survive this. He left her room, leaving the door ajar, and went downstairs. In the kitchen, he poured himself a glass of water, but he didn't drink it. Instead, he looked out the window, where his own face was reflected, tired, aged, but still determined. He didn't know how their lives would turn out, but he knew one thing. He would do anything to protect his children, even if it meant fighting the woman he once loved more than anything in the world. Fall was gathering strength in Millsboro, the leaves turning crimson and gold, and the air sharp with a taste of approaching winter. Mark Peterson drove down the highway, his fingers gripping the steering wheel as if it were the last anchor in his crumbling world. It had been a week since he had told the kids the truth, and every day was filled with their pain, their silent disappointment. Sophie had withdrawn into herself, spending hours behind the closed door of her room, and Luke, despite his attempts to appear cheerful, had grown quieter, his smiles less frequent. Mark tried to be strong for them, but inside he felt as empty as a house that no longer echoed with Emily's laughter. She called almost every day, leaving messages full of tears and promises. "Mark, please give me a chance," she wrote. "I'll do anything to fix this. I'll break up with Jason. For you, for the kids." Her words sounded sincere, but every time Mark reread them, he saw the pictures the detective had shown him. Emily and Jason, their smiles, their closeness. Those images burned him like a hot iron, and he couldn't believe her promises. Not completely, but some part of him, the part that still remembered their first years together, their dreams, their love, wanted to give her a chance. He hated himself for this weakness, but he couldn't deny it. This morning she sent another message. "Mark, let's meet. I want to talk. I'll do anything to get you back." He didn't respond, but her words stuck in his head like a splinter. He didn't know what he wanted: to forgive her or to erase her from his life completely. But he knew one thing: he needed to see the truth with his own eyes. Not through a detective's lens, not through text messages, but in person. He needed to see Emily and Jason together to understand if there was even a drop of sincerity in her words. That evening, while Sophie was at her friend's house and Luke was playing video games in his room, the doorbell rang. Mark knew who it was before he answered. Emily was standing there, her coat slightly damp from the light rain and her eyes red as if she had been crying again. She didn't look like a confident financial advisor, but like a woman who had lost everything. Her hair, usually neatly styled, was now disheveled and her lipstick was slightly smudged. "Mark," her voice shook as she stepped forward. "Please, let me in. We need to talk." He wanted to say no, wanted to slam the door, but something in her eyes, a mixture of desperation and pain, stopped him. He stepped back, letting her in. They walked into the living room, where the wine stain still lingered on the carpet, a reminder of the night his world had fallen apart. Emily stopped in the middle of the room, her hands fiddling nervously with the strap of her bag. "I know you hate me," she began, not looking at him. "And I deserve it. But Mark, I swear, I want to fix this. I already told Jason that we're done. I want to be with you, with the kids. I want our family back." Mark looked at her, trying to find the truth in her words. Her voice was full of emotion, but he had heard it too many times in the last weeks, those promises, those tears. He wanted to believe it, but he couldn't. "This isn't the first time you've said this," he said, his voice cold but calm. "You promised to stop, but you kept lying. You transferred our money to your account. You lied to me, to the children, to everyone. Why should I believe you now?" Emily winced, her eyes filling with tears, but she didn't back down. "Because I lost everything," she said, her voice breaking. "I lost you. I lost Sophie's and Luke's trust. I know what I did, Mark, but I don't want to lose our family. Please, give me a chance. I'll do anything to prove that I'm serious." Mark looked at her, and his heart broke. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that they could start over, but the pictures the detective had shown him were still in front of his eyes. He saw her smile, her hand in Jason's, her happiness that was not at home. He couldn't just forget it. "I don't know, Emily," he said finally. "I don't know if I can trust you. I need time, and I need to see for myself that you're telling the truth." She nodded, wiping away her tears. "Okay, I'll do whatever you want. Just don't push me away. Don't destroy our family." Mark didn't answer. He walked her to the door, and when she left, he felt a determination growing inside him. He couldn't just wait for her to prove her case. He needed to know for sure. The following evening, Mark decided to take action. Emily had texted him that she was meeting colleagues at a restaurant downtown. He didn't believe her, not after all he'd learned. He left Luke with a neighbor, saying he had urgent business, and Sophie was at a friend's, as usual. He took the car keys and drove downtown, his heart pounding with a mixture of anger and fear. The restaurant Emily had mentioned was a trendy place with picture windows and soft light spilling onto the sidewalk. Mark parked across the street in the shadows so as not to be seen. He felt stupid, like the hero of a bad detective movie, but there was no turning back. He had to see. Through the window, he spotted her immediately. Emily was sitting at a table by the window, her dark green dress flattering her figure, her hair pulled back into an elegant bun. Across from her sat a man tall, with dark hair slightly touched with gray, wearing an impeccable suit. Jason Miller. Mark had never seen him in person, but he knew who it was right away. His posture, his confident smile, his hand casually resting on the table, too close to Emily's, all confirmed that it was him. They laughed. Emily leaned a little closer to him, her eyes shining, like she was happy. Mark watched, and every gesture, every look, was a blow. She had promised to break up with him. She had sworn she wanted her family back. But here, in this quiet restaurant across town, it was as if she had never been out of his life. Not Mark's life, but Jason's. The soft light from the street lamps filtered through the window, casting golden circles on the table in front of them. Emily's glass was stained with her lipstick, the same shade Mark had once given her for their anniversary. He recognized it from afar. Now it belonged to another evening, another man, another life. Mark sat in his car across from the restaurant. He felt the steering wheel slowly warming under his hands from the tension in his fingers. His heart was pulsing in his chest, heavy and dull, not from anger, not from resentment, but from some cold, icy understanding. Everything he had protected was cracking right now. He pulled out his phone, his fingers shaking as he took the first picture. Emily and Jason, their hands almost touching, their smiles bright, like there was no one else in the world. The second picture, her hand on his. The third, Jason whispering something in her ear, and she throws her head back, laughing in a way Mark hadn't heard her laugh in months. Each photo was like the last nail. He didn't look away, didn't close his eyes. He wanted to absorb everything, to remember every detail of this evening, this table by the window, this glass of wine that she brought to her lips, so that later he could tell Mark that she was late at work. He opened their chat. On the screen were their old messages. "We'll all be together soon. I'll fix it. You have to trust me." Lies. Words that meant nothing anymore. He attached one of the photos. Under it, he wrote just two words: "It's all over." He pressed send. The phone flashed silently delivered, and he turned it off, throwing it onto the seat next to him. Silence reigned in the car. Someone was laughing behind the window. A car was driving by. Headlights flashed an ordinary summer evening, when the city lived its own life, and did not notice how someone's family was dying in some parked car. Mark closed his eyes and exhaled. That was it. There were no more promises, no more persuasions, no more empty "I'm sorry." just a cold that suddenly seemed lighter than the pain that had been burning inside him all this time. When Mark got home, the rain had gotten heavier, pounding the roof of the car. He sat in the dark, without turning on the lights, looking out at the empty yard. The porch lights were flickering, but now they seemed less like a symbol of comfort and more like a reminder that everything he thought was his was a lie. He thought about Sophie and Luke and how they would live their lives. He thought about the divorce, the courts, and how to explain to his children that their mother had chosen someone else. But most of all, he thought about how to keep this pain from breaking them. He walked into the house, where it was quiet except for the ticking of the clock in the hallway. Luke was asleep, and Sophie had not yet returned. Mark went up to his bedroom, where the note from Emily, which he had not thrown away, was still lying. He took it, reread the words, "I love you," and slowly tore the paper into tiny pieces. It was a symbolic break, small but final. He knew he would never go back. Their family, such as it was, died the moment he sent that photo. He lay down on the bed, still dressed, and closed his eyes. The rain pounded the windows, and Mark thought that maybe this was his chance to start over. Not with Emily, but with the kids, with himself. But for now, he just wanted to get through the night. The courtroom in downtown Millsboro was cold and impersonal, with gray walls and long rows of wooden benches polished to a shine by thousands of nervous hands. The morning light filtered through the tall windows, but it brought no warmth, only highlighting the sterility of the room where families were decided, dreams were shattered, and lives were rewritten. Mark Peterson sat on one of those benches, his fingers fiddling with the cuff of his shirt, his gaze fixed on the judge's empty seat. His attorney, Richard Clark, sat next to him, shuffling papers in a leather binder, his expression calm but focused. Mark, on the other hand, felt a storm raging inside him, a mixture of anger, fatigue, and fear of what would happen next. It had been 3 months since the night he'd sent Emily a photo taken at a restaurant with the laconic caption, "It's over." Since then, their communication had been limited to short messages through lawyers and the occasional call when the conversation turned to the children. Emily had tried to contact him directly, leaving voicemails full of tears and apologies, but Mark no longer responded. He couldn't. Every word she said was like salt in a wound, and her promises were as empty as the wind blowing through their empty house. He knew she'd gone to Jason Miller, and the thought, though dulled by time, still burned inside him. Today was the day of the trial, the culmination of months of preparation, evidence gathering, and sleepless nights as Mark replayed every moment of their marriage in his head, trying to figure out where it had all gone wrong. He didn't want this war, but Emily had left him little choice. Her infidelity, her secret money transfers, her lies, all of it had been the foundation of the case that Richard had built with the cold precision of a surgeon. Mark trusted him, but he was still afraid. Not for himself, but for Sophie and Luke. They had already lost their mother, not physically, but emotionally, and he didn't want the trial to take away the stability he had been trying to maintain. The room slowly filled with people. A law clerk, Emily's lawyer, a sharp-eyed young woman named Linda Harris, dressed in a sharp suit, and a few bystanders whose presence Mark couldn't explain. Emily entered last, her steps quiet, almost hesitant. She looked different from their previous encounters. Her face was pale, without her usual makeup, and the dark circles under her eyes betrayed sleepless nights. She didn't look at Mark as she took a seat next to her lawyer, her hands clutching her purse nervously. Mark felt a twinge of pity, but quickly suppressed it. She had made her choice, and now they were both reaping the consequences. The judge, an older woman with gray hair pulled back into a neat bun, walked into the courtroom and everyone stood. Her name, Elizabeth Walker, was etched on a plaque in front of her, and her gaze, stern but not without sympathy, slid over everyone's faces. She announced the start of the hearing, and Mark felt his heart beat faster. Richard spoke first, his voice confident but not aggressive. He presented evidence of Emily's infidelity, photographs taken by a private investigator, correspondence Mark had received from Paul Winters, even a photo he had taken at a restaurant. Each image, each text, was projected onto the screen, and Mark saw Emily's head hang, her shoulders shake. Richard spoke of how her actions had undermined the trust in their marriage, how she had violated their commitment to each other. Then he moved on to the financial shenanigans. My client, Mrs. Peterson, transferred significant amounts of money from their joint account to her personal account over a period of a year and a half, without Mr. Peterson's knowledge, Richard said, holding up the statements. These transfers, labeled as investments, totaled over $30,000. We believe this was done to conceal assets in anticipation of a possible divorce. Linda Harris countered, her voice sharp but professional. Your Honor, my client admits that she transferred the money, but it was part of her professional activities as a financial advisor. The funds were intended for investments that would benefit the family. We have documents showing that these investments were made with Mr. Peterson's consent. Mark felt anger flare in his chest. He had never consented to these transfers. He hadn't even known about them until Richard showed him the statements. But he held back, trusting his lawyer. Richard presented further evidence, the lack of any record of Mark's consent, and the fact that the account the money was being transferred to was registered solely in Emily's name. The judge listened intently, taking notes, her face unreadable. The room grew quieter as custody issues came up. Richard stressed that Mark had been the children's primary caregiver in recent months, providing them with emotional and financial stability. He mentioned how Sophie and Luke had been traumatized by their mother's departure and how Mark had tried to maintain a routine for them. Linda, for her part, argued that Emily wanted to maintain contact with the children and was open to joint custody, but her case was weakened, especially when Richard presented evidence from neighbors and teachers who confirmed that Emily had been largely absent from home in recent months. Emily finally spoke, her voice quiet but full of emotion. Your Honor, I admit my mistakes, she said, looking at the judge. I failed my family, but I love my children. Sophie and Luke are everything to me. I want to be a part of their lives, even if I'm not a part of Mark's life anymore. Mark looked at her, and his heart sank. He saw her pain, her sincerity, but he couldn't forget her lies. He didn't want to take their mother away from the children, but he couldn't let her destroy them even more. The judge nodded, writing something down, and called a break. After the break, the division of property began to be discussed. The Petersons' house, their most prized possession, became the central topic. Mark insisted that he keep it, not out of greed, but because it was the only island of stability for Sophie and Luke. They had grown up in this house, knew every corner, every creaking floorboard. Taking it away from them would be too cruel. Richard presented evidence that Mark had made the bulk of the mortgage payment and also stressed that Emily had effectively abandoned the family by moving in with Jason Miller. Linda fought back, arguing that Emily was entitled to half the property, including the house, but her arguments were undermined by the financial machinations. The judge, after carefully reviewing the documents, ruled in Mark's favor. The house was awarded to him, with the stipulation that he continue to pay the remaining mortgage. Emily received some of their savings, but a significant amount transferred to her personal account was deemed an illegal asset concealment, and she was forced to return half of it to Mark. When it came to custody, Mark felt his throat tighten. This was the moment he dreaded more than anything. He knew Sophie and Luke wanted to stay with him, but the thought of Emily taking them, even partially, was unbearable. The judge, however, took into account the evidence of the children, who, despite their ages, had clearly expressed a desire to live with their father. Sophie, in particular, was adamant, her words to a psychologist quoted in court, "I don't want to live with her. She's abandoned us." Luke was more lenient, but also said he felt better with their dad. The judge ruled that the children would live with Mark with joint custody, but with Emily's right to regular visits. When the decision was announced, Mark felt relief mixed with bitterness. He had won, but the victory was not joyful. He looked at Emily, who sat with her head down, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. He wanted to say something, but the words caught in his throat. This was the end of their marriage, the end of their family as it had been. After the trial, Emily approached Mark in the hallway. Her eyes were red, but she held herself with a dignity he hadn't expected. "Mark," she said quietly, "I know you'll never forgive me, and I'm not asking you to. But I want you to know that I'll always love Sophie and Luke, and I'll always be sorry for what I did to us. Mark looked at her, conflicting feelings warring in his chest. He wanted to hate her, but all he felt was tiredness. He nodded without saying a word and turned to leave. Emily remained standing, her figure small and lost in the empty hallway. A few days later, he learned that she had permanently moved in with Jason. Neighbors whispered that they had seen her car outside his house, a large mansion in the hills with panoramic windows and a swimming pool. Mark felt no jealousy, only emptiness. She had chosen her new life, and he had to build his own for the children for himself. Back home, Mark sat at the kitchen table, where the photograph of their family on the beach still sat. He looked at it, at their smiles, and knew that that life was in the past. Sophie and Luke were upstairs, and he knew he would have to talk to them again soon, explain that the trial was over, that their lives were now officially different. He was afraid of their reaction, but he knew they could handle it. They were stronger than he thought. He stood up, put the photograph away in a drawer, and began to make dinner. It was a small step, but it was important. The house that was now his was their sanctuary, and Mark was determined to make it a place where Sophie and Luke could feel safe again. He didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like they had a chance. Not at their old life, but at a new one different, but perhaps still good. Millsboro was immersed in the chill of winter as the first snowflakes began to swirl over the suburban streets, covering the lawns in a thin blanket of white. In Jason Miller's house, nestled in the hills where each mansion looked like a small palace, Emily Peterson tried to convince herself that her new life was everything she had dreamed of. The mansion was spacious, with marble floors, huge windows overlooking the snow-covered hills, and a fireplace in which a log fire crackled, creating the illusion of coziness. Emily sat on the leather sofa, holding a glass of white wine and staring into the fire, trying to drown out the voice inside that whispered that all this was just a temporary refuge. The first months after the trial were a whirlwind of emotions. She had moved in with Jason, leaving behind the home she had built with Mark and the family she had destroyed with her own hands. At first, she had felt euphoric. Jason was attentive, generous. His charisma and confidence eclipsed everything that remained of her previous life. He took her to expensive restaurants, gave her designer dresses, told her that she was his inspiration, his muse. Emily clung to these words like a drowning man to a straw, convincing herself that she had made the right choice. She had lost Mark, she had lost the trust of Sophie and Luke, but she had Jason, a man who, she thought, saw her as more than just a wife and mother. Every morning she woke up in his enormous bedroom, where the bed was the size of a small room and the sheets smelled like expensive laundry detergent. She stared at her reflection in the mirror of the Italian-tiled bathroom and told herself that this was her new life. She tried not to think about Sophie, who had stopped answering her calls, or Luke, whose texts were short and formal. She told herself that in time they would understand, that they would forgive her. But deep down, she knew it was a lie. The first weeks in Jason's house were like a fairy tale. He hosted dinners with colleagues, introducing Emily as his partner, not just his mistress. She glowed at these events, wearing elegant dresses he picked out for her, and smiled when he praised her intelligence and professionalism. Her colleagues at Miller and Associates looked at her with admiration, and some with ill-concealed envy. Emily felt on top of the world. She wasn't just a suburban wife. She was a woman who had achieved success, who had chosen passion and freedom over routine. Jason was generous. He gave her a new phone, replacing the old one that held too many memories of Mark and the kids. He paid for her spa treatments, bought her tickets to art shows and concerts, took her to restaurants where a single dinner cost more than her and Mark's monthly food budget. But even in these moments, when she laughed at his jokes or listened to him talk about business, something cold and uneasy stirred in her chest. She noticed how his eyes sometimes slid past her, how he was distracted by his phone, how his attention, so bright at first, began to fade. By the end of the third month, Emily began to sense that something was changing. Jason was staying late more often, citing urgent business and important clients. His calls became less frequent, his smiles less genuine. He was still polite, even affectionate, but there was a distance in his tone that Emily knew all too well. It was the same distance she had shown Mark in the last years of their marriage. The irony was not lost on her, but she pushed it away, telling herself that Jason was simply busy. One night, when he canceled their dinner plans yet again, Emily decided to surprise him. She wore his favorite dress black, with a low neckline, ordered dinner from his favorite restaurant, and lit candles in the living room. When Jason came home, his face lit up with surprise for a moment, but then he smiled that smile that now seemed more formal than sincere. "Emily, that's sweet," he said, putting his briefcase down. "But I'm awfully tired. Can we reschedule for another day?" She nodded, feeling something tighten inside her. Dinner had gone cold on the table, and the candles had burned out, leaving only the smell of wax. Emily sat alone in the vast living room, looking at her reflection in the dark windows. She remembered how Mark would cook dinner for her, even when he was tired from work, how he always took the time to listen to her. She pushed the thoughts away, but they returned like persistent ghosts. 6 months after the trial, Emily began to notice that Jason was increasingly mentioning a new employee at their firm, Claire, a young woman fresh out of college. He spoke of her with the same admiration he once had for Emily. "She's so talented. She has a fresh perspective. She's a fast learner." Emily tried to ignore it, but every time he mentioned Claire, her heart sank with foreboding. One evening, she happened to see his phone lying on the table. The screen lit up with an incoming message, and the name Claire flashed brightly. Emily froze, her hand reaching for the phone, but she stopped herself. She didn't want to be the one rummaging through other people's things, but curiosity, or rather, fear was stronger. She opened the chat and read a few lines. These were not business messages. These were words full of flirtation, innuendo, and promise. "You make me feel alive," Jason wrote. Emily felt her world crumble for the second time. She didn't make a scene. Instead, she waited until Jason got home and asked him directly, trying to keep her voice calm. "Who is Claire?" Her words hung in the air like an accusation. Jason looked at her, his eyebrows raised, but he didn't look away. "Claire? Just a colleague," he said, but his voice was too smooth, too rehearsed. "You don't think I saw the messages," Emily interrupted, her voice shaking. "Don't lie to me, Jason. I know what it looks like." He sighed, leaning back against the sofa, his face, usually so confident, now showing weariness. "Emily," he said, "I didn't want you to find out like this. Claire, she's young, ambitious, like you once were. I didn't plan it, but it happened." His words echoed her own, spoken to mark the night everything had fallen apart. Emily felt her throat tighten, but the tears did not come. She looked at Jason, the man she had destroyed her family for, and knew that he had never been who she thought he was. He was a hunter of novelty, of excitement, and now that she was no longer novel to him, he had found someone else. "Get out," she said quietly but firmly. "Or, you know what? This is your home. I'm leaving." Jason didn't stop her. He just nodded as if it were inevitable. Emily packed her things not much, considering she'd come to him almost empty-handed and left that night. She rented a small apartment downtown with shabby walls and creaky floors, and for the first time in years, she felt completely alone. Emily's apartment was tiny, with one window overlooking a busy street and old furniture she'd bought at a garage sale. She sat on the couch that smelled of dust and stared at the boxes she'd never unpacked. Her life, once full of ambition and plans, now fit into those boxes: a few dresses, a few photographs she couldn't bring herself to throw out, and memories that burned more than she'd expected. She tried to contact Sophie and Luke, but Sophie didn't answer, and Luke wrote short, polite messages that seemed more formal. She knew she had lost them, and that thought was harder than breaking up with Jason. She had lost everything: her family, her home, her love, even the illusion of a new life that was as fragile as her marriage. Sometimes, late at night, when the city outside her window was quiet, Emily would put on the old playlist she and Mark used to listen to in their first apartment. Bob Dylan and Norah Jones would fill the room, and she would close her eyes, imagining what could have been if she had made different choices. She would think about Mark, about his kindness, about his patience, and about how she had betrayed him. She would think about Sophie and Luke, about the way they had looked at her one last time, with pain, with disappointment. And she knew that this was her punishment, not Jason, not his new love, but this emptiness she found herself in. Emily sat in the dark, looking out the window at the snowy street, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to cry. Not from self-pity, but from the realization that she had destroyed everything she had. And now she had to live with it alone in a rented apartment with memories she could neither forget nor fix. Winter in Millsboro had blanketed the suburbs in a soft blanket of snow, turning the familiar streets into a Christmas card setting. The Peterson house, now officially Mark's, glowed in the soft light of the fairy lights Luke had insisted on hanging back in early December. The snow crunched under his feet as Mark walked home from work, his breath steaming, a cautious hope in his chest, not the heady euphoria of youth, but a quiet, mature sense that life, despite everything, was going on. It had been 6 months since the court had ended his marriage to Emily, and though the wounds still ached, they no longer bled. Mark had gotten used to life without Emily, but that didn't mean he'd forgotten her. Her shadow still lingered in small things, the coffee mug she loved, the scent of her perfume that sometimes seemed to linger in the bedroom, the questions Luke sometimes asked if he'd see his mother for Christmas. But Mark had learned to cope. He got up every morning, made breakfast for Sophie and Luke, drove them to school, worked, came home, and found the strength to smile. His children were his anchor, his reason to move forward, and he was determined to give them a home full of warmth, even if there was one less person in it. It was a cold night before Christmas, but the Petersons' house was bustling with activity. The living room had become a workshop, with boxes of tinsel, lights, and baubles scattered on the floor, and a tree in the center, still a little askew because Luke had insisted they do it themselves. Sophie sat on the couch, untangling a tangle of lights, her brow furrowed, but the corners of her mouth twitching into a smile. Luke, on the other hand, was in his element, running around the tree, hanging baubles that he said should be everywhere to make it cool. "Dad, look!" Luke proudly showed off the shiny red ball he'd hung so high he almost knocked over the tree. "This is going to be our most epic tree yet." Mark, standing on the stepladder and trying to secure the star to the top of his head, laughed. His laughter was sincere, for the first time in a long time not laced with bitterness. "Epic, huh?" He came down, patting Luke on the head. "Just don't knock her over, hero. We don't need a Christmas disaster." Sophie snorted, finally untangling the garland. "He already nearly caused a disaster when he tried to decorate the fireplace," she said, rolling her eyes, but her voice was soft, without its usual barb. Mark looked at his daughter, and his heart ached with warmth. Sophie had changed in the last few months. Her anger at Emily hadn't disappeared, but it had quieted, turning into a tired sadness. She'd started talking to Mark more often, sharing her thoughts, and he could see how she was trying to be strong, not just for herself, but for Luke. They were a team, and that was what Mark was most grateful for. "Okay, team," he said, clapping his hands. "Let's light this thing and see what happens." Luke rushed to the outlet, and a second later the tree was lit up with multicolored lights. The living room filled with a soft glow, reflected in the windows, and Mark felt something like peace spreading inside him. He looked at the children, who were arguing over where to hang another ball, and he knew that, despite everything, they were coping. They were a family, not a perfect one, but a real one. Later, after Luke had run off to check his presents under the tree and Sophie had gone to her room, Mark sat on the couch with a mug of hot chocolate. He watched the lights flicker in time with his thoughts and thought about how far they had come from the nightmare that had begun a year ago. Emily's calls were less frequent, her messages were shorter, and Mark knew she was trying to build a life for herself without him, without the kids. He didn't feel hatred, just a little sadness. She was part of his past, but not his future. A few days after Christmas, Mark walked into a small cafe on the main street of Millsboro. Bean and Brew was a cozy place with wooden tables, the smell of freshly brewed coffee, and old vinyl records playing in the background. He often came here to work or just to take his mind off things. Today, he sat by the window, opened his laptop, and began to scroll through work emails, but his gaze kept drifting to the snowy street where people were hurrying with gift bags. More coffee? The waitress's voice brought him out of his reverie. Mark looked up and was met with a smiling young woman. Her name was Kelly. He knew from the name tag she wore on her green apron. She was in her 30s, with dark hair pulled back into a messy bun and eyes that always seemed to glow with warmth. She had been working at the cafe for a few months, and Mark had noticed her before, not for anything in particular, but simply because her kindness was infectious. "Yes, please," he said, smiling back. "And maybe one of those cinnamon muffins?" Kelly nodded, her smile growing wider. "Good choice. The muffins are fresh today. I baked them myself," she said, setting the coffee pot on the table and pouring him another portion. "Working even after Christmas. Merciless." Mark laughed, and this laugh surprised even himself. He had not laughed so easily for a long time. "Well, someone's got to keep the world in order," he replied, closing his laptop. "What about you? Aren't you tired of pouring coffee for the likes of me?" Kelly shrugged, her eyes twinkling with amusement. "Only if people like you don't leave tips," she said with a wink and went off to get a cupcake. Mark watched her go, feeling something stir inside him, a faint, almost forgotten sense of interest. It wasn't love, it wasn't passion, but it was something new, like the first ray of sunshine after a long winter. When Kelly returned with the cupcake, she lingered at his table a little longer than necessary. "You sit here a lot," she noted, placing a plate in front of him. "Always with your laptop, always alone. Isn't it boring?" Mark shrugged, but his smile didn't disappear. "Sometimes. But you know, I have 2 children, so loneliness is a luxury." Kelly laughed, her laugh ringing like a bell. "I understand. I have nephews, they are like a hurricane. But still cool, right?" "It's true," Mark nodded, and for a moment their eyes met, and there was something light, unobtrusive, but warm about it. Kelly left to serve other customers, and Mark sat there, staring at the cupcake he hadn't even tried. He thought about her, not Kelly the person, but what she represented. A chance to start over, a chance to feel something other than the pain and responsibility. He wasn't ready for another relationship, but the idea that it was possible was a breath of fresh air. That night, back home, Mark sat in the living room, looking at the Christmas tree, still standing in the corner. Sophie and Luke were asleep upstairs, their laughter and arguments over how best to decorate the house still echoing in his mind. He thought about Kelly, her smile, how easy it was to talk to her. But he also thought about Emily, her secrets, her phone hidden under her pillow, her lies that had torn their family apart. He stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the snowy yard. His reflection in the glass was calm but determined. He knew that if he ever decided to start over, he would do it differently. Without secrets, without omissions, without fear of being deceived. He turned to the tree, where among the balls hung the small star Luke had made at school, and whispered, as if making a promise to himself. From this time on, no secrets. Mark didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face it. With his children, with his home, with himself, and maybe with someone who would look at him the way Kelly had looked at him today. Not with pity, not with guilt, but with genuine, living interest. And that was enough to take the first step into a new life. Summer in Millsboro was a colorful affair, with petunias blooming in the flower beds along the streets and the scent of freshly mown grass and linden trees filling the air. The Peterson house was as green as it had been the year before, but there was a new energy to it, now not the stiff silence that had reigned after Emily had left, but the lively, warm bustle that only comes from families who have learned to smile again. The garlands on the porch that Luke had once hung with such enthusiasm had been replaced with brighter ones, and in the backyard there was a small gazebo that Mark had built with his children the previous spring. In the sunlit living room, Sophie and Luke sat on the couch, hunched over a laptop. Sophie, now 15, her long hair in a loose braid, was scrolling through photos of beaches on a travel agency website, her eyes bright with anticipation. Luke, who had just turned 11, was pointing at a picture of a water park. "This is the place, Dad," he exclaimed, his voice ringing with excitement. "It has roller coasters like in the movies. We have to go there." Mark smiled, shaking his head as he stood at the kitchen island where he was slicing apples for a pie. His face, still showing traces of weariness from years past, now looked lighter, younger. Kelly stood next to him, her dark hair pulled back into a high ponytail, a flower stain on her apron. She laughed at Luke, her laughter like music, filling the house with warmth. "Luke, if we choose this water park, I'm going to demand that you go on the scariest ride first," she teased, winking at Sophie. "Ha, I'm not scared." Luke puffed out his chest, but Sophie rolled her eyes. "You were yelling on the carousel last year," she said, but her voice was soft, without the usual teenage barb. Mark looked at the children, then at Kelly, and felt his heart fill with quiet gratitude. A year ago, he couldn't have imagined their lives would be like this, full of laughter, plans, simple joys. Kelly had entered their lives slowly, unobtrusively, first as a friend, then as something more. She didn't try to take Emily's place, and that was what won over both Mark and the children. She was herself with her love of baking, her habit of humming old songs, and her ability to listen without judgment. Sophie, wary at first, now chatted with Kelly about books and music, and Luke adored her for teaching him how to make perfect pancakes. They were planning a vacation, the first real vacation as a foursome. Mark wanted to take them to the coast, where they could walk on the beach, build sandcastles, and forget about the past, if only for a week. Kelly suggested a beach house with a porch and a view of the sunset, and Mark could see her eyes light up when she described roasting marshmallows over a campfire. This wasn't just a trip, it was their chance to make new memories that were theirs alone. Later, after the kids had gone upstairs to pick out movies for the evening, Mark and Kelly were in the kitchen finishing up dinner. On the table was an envelope that Mark had noticed when he returned from work. The handwriting was familiar, and he knew immediately who it was from. Emily. He didn't open it right away, deciding to wait until the kids had left so as not to disturb them. Kelly noticed his gaze and placed her hand on his shoulder. "Do you want me to stay?" she asked quietly, her voice full of support. Mark shook his head, smiling at her. "No, I can handle it. Go help Luke not pick another superhero movie. We need a break from the explosions." She laughed and walked out of the kitchen, leaving him alone with the letter. Mark sat at the table, staring at the envelope as if it were a bomb waiting to explode. He hadn't heard from Emily in months. She'd called a couple of times to arrange visits with the kids, but Sophie had refused, and Luke had only agreed to short outings. Mark had let the kids decide for themselves how to build a relationship with their mother. He opened the envelope, and inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in her neat handwriting. "Dear Mark, I know you probably don't want to read this, but I have to try. I can't undo what I've done, but I want you to know that I'm sorry. I regret every day I lied to you, every choice I made that destroyed our family. I lost everything, not just you and the kids, but myself. The life I chose was empty, and I know it's my fault. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I know I don't deserve it. But I do ask one thing. Tell Sophie and Luke that I love them, and if they ever want to see me, I'll always be there. Emily." Mark read the letter twice, his fingers tightening around the page, but there was no anger inside. Just weariness and a little sadness, not for himself, but for the woman who had once been the center of his world. He knew Emily was living alone in her small apartment, that Jason had left her for a new mistress, that her career, once so brilliant, was now overshadowed by her mistakes. He felt no gloating, only regret that things could have been different. He stood up, went to the closet in the living room, and opened the drawer where he kept old photographs and documents. He put Emily's letter in there, along with other pieces of their past, the wedding album, a card from Sophie on his 40th birthday, a note from Luke thanking him for a new bike. It was a box of memories he no longer wanted to keep in sight, but he couldn't throw them away either. The past was locked, and Mark was willing to leave it there. He walked back into the living room, where Kelly and the kids were already arguing over which movie to watch. Luke was pushing for an action movie, Sophie wanted a comedy, and Kelly was suggesting something in between an old adventure movie. Mark watched them, and his heart warmed. This was his family, not perfect, but his, and he knew he would do anything to protect them. "Okay, enough arguing," he said, sitting down on the couch and picking up the remote. "Let's vote. But I'm for Kelly, so get ready for adventure." Luke groaned, Sophie laughed, and Kelly winked at him. At that moment, Mark realized that a second chance wasn't just a word. It was a reality he built every day with the people he was with, and he knew that it wasn't for everyone. Emily had made her choice, and now she had to live with the consequences. And Mark had chosen life with children, with Kelly, with a future he could see as clear as a summer sky. "A second chance isn't for everyone," he whispered, looking at the blinking lights on the tree, and smiled, feeling like he was home for the first time in a long time. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.